Hello and welcome, I'm Tafaraq Damu. The Organization of African Unity was founded 50 years ago. In 2001, it evolved into the African Union, thereby providing a fresh perspective. Well, what are the key challenges? My guest today, BerhaneDeressa, a seasoned Ethiopian diplomat, is chairman of the Board of Forum for the Study of Foreign Policy, an association of former Ethiopian ambassadors and senior international civil servants. Welcome to the program, Dr. Berhane.
Thank you.
The whole discourse here today that we are having on the show is all about the Organization of African Unity, and it evolved, as you very well know, in 2001 into what we know today as the African Union. It's turning 50 coming May, but the way the Organization of African Unity was conceived is a little bit tricky, wasn't it, when the founding fathers came together here in Addis Ababa and said, hey, time to move forward.
This was a very difficult time. Almost there was nothing to recommend Addis Ababa or even the Ethiopian government of that day as a leader, as a model for any country, because as you remember, there was wars of liberation even fought against Ethiopia and the north and the eastern part of the country. The government was a very conservative government of the emperor. But Ethiopia had other assets which appealed to the rest of the world. One,
what other assets except that it remained independent for ages?
That's a big asset, you know. This is in a continent that was totally colonized, almost totally colonized. Ethiopia maintained it, and then in a very dramatic way, it defeated the first Italian effort to colonize Ethiopia in 1896, the Battle of Adwa. And it remained independent, and 40 years later, another effort was made by the fascist forces, and there was a very, very serious resistance to this, to the fascist occupation. So, real asset at that time to attract so many African leaders to come to Addis Ababa was one, this history of resistance against European colonial ambitions. And the second one is the emperor's charisma and his personality also. In Africa, elderly statesmen are respected, number one. Number two, he was a very well-known anti-fascist hero in the class of President de Gaulle of France, Churchill of the United Kingdom, Stalin of Russia, Roosevelt of the United States of America. So he was and Tito of Yugoslavia. He was in that class of leaders of the time. And his invitation was responded to very positively.
Because we had two groups, like the Casablanca and the Moravia group, were conservative.
That's another factor that made the situation very difficult also. Africa was divided into two groups. The Casablanca, comprising of more revolutionary kinds of government, and the Monrovia group, reformist. But there was nothing that will bring them together to handle or to deal with issues that of common interest. So when the emperor...
So it's fair to state that it was a very tricky kind of...
Yes, definitely, it was tricky. It was tricky, and also Addis Ababa had nothing to offer really in those days. I mean, there are cities in Africa which are facilities and so on and so forth. The communication was very poor. I remember to go to Ghana, you had to fly to London. Even to go to Nairobi, you had to go to Europe at that time, and communication was very poor until the Ethiopian Airlines was conceived in such a way at least to create a link between East and West Africa. So the time was difficult time. So when these groups came, and of course, there were people like Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was an emerging leader in the Arab world and in Africa too, and with good credentials. He had victoriously dealt with the Suez crisis and so on and so forth. But there was some tension between Ethiopia, between the emperor and who is a monarchy, and the other one who is a very revolutionary Republican kind of person. And then there was Nkrumah, a Pan-Africanist, very, very dynamic leader with very strong views about where Africa should go. So it is in this situation that the OAU's meeting was held in Addis Ababa.
Yeah, I would like to push the years a little bit faster forward. You know, the Organization of African Unity was a very important factor in the decolonization process. But this was an organization that was basically limbless.
Well, that's what all organizations are for that matter, because they don't have their own military force to do anything. What they have is a moral force. What they have is bring people, or governments together to act on an issue. And I think the emergence of the OAU, the African organization, had helped the decolonization process a lot. It had given a forum to Africans to come together and have a common stand on issues. And without this forum, it would have taken much longer. Even with it, the entrenched colonialists like the Portuguese and the racist regime of South Africa was a big problem. So it may not have solved or come to anywhere near solving the burning issues of Africa. But take the United Nations. What can the United Nations do? Still, it's limitless. Any organization as strong as the members want to make it. And the members of these organizations are really powerful, great powers of the West, or superpowers, and so on and so forth.
After the majority of African states became independent, what followed was the conflicts, intrastate conflicts. And African countries cannot to this day deal with this major problem.
That's true. But that's also in the nature of things. I mean, people have differences. And if they don't have a mechanism by which they settle those differences, the tendency is to resort to conflict. That is where organizations like, regional organizations like the OAU, I was, and AU today, will help in the establishing norms, principles, legal framework by which such differences can be resolved.
There are a few instruments.
Yeah, those instruments. And conflicts arise, unfortunately, where there is no freedom, really, where there is some kind of abuse of human rights. I mean, that has been historically, that's what sent people to the mountains to fight against this regime and that regime. And this cannot be achieved over one generation, over sitting around the conference table only. It has to be ingrained in the psyche of the people. There has to be education. I mean, look how long the Europeans fought with each other, the 30 Years' War, the 100 Years' War. They fought on frivolous issues like how many angels can dance on a head of a needle. I mean, to exaggerate a little bit. So compared to their history, I think Africa has not done that badly.
I feel that peace is an important factor if Africa is going to move ahead. Mm-hmm. And the African Union, as an institution, as a continental institution, has this institution been able to kind of address all these problems, you think?
Well, if you are talking at specific issues, perhaps not. But what both the UN and OAU have strived to do and have done is to put the ground rules down. There is a progressive legislation of international law, international norms, which would not have been possible without this organization, without the OAU. And slowly but surely, countries are ascribing to it. They are becoming part of this, but that's not enough. There has to be a universal kind of educating process for this thing to be. For instance, the AU and the OAU before that had focused a lot on human rights issues. Many legislations in that area, and after the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, I think the AU Convention, the AU legislation on OAU legislation on the human rights, people's rights, is a very, very basic document. Now, what one hopes will happen in the future is that these instruments are taught in schools. They are made a requirement for the judges, for bureaucrats, for everybody to read and learn and develop this culture of that seems to have been developed very well in the Western world. The rule of law. I mean, unless...
So what does the track record show?
Of what?
Along the rule of law, that the human rights issues.
Good and bad, you know. On the bad side, there are lots of violations, left and right, in Africa, everywhere. On the good side, there is, the paradigm is changing. People are talking about, very reluctantly, governments that would not have considered, are considering allowing human rights organizations to function. They may restrict them by this regulation, that regulation, but generally it is going forward. I'm very optimistic in this sense, because not partly because I know the kind of history Europe went through, what they did to each other. I know how much bloodshed was shed in America during the Civil War. The question was whether people like me and you are human beings or some kind of apes, you know. Even that was settled. Millions of people died in the United States during the same in Russia and everywhere in the world. So the outside world has done more bloodshedding than the Africans. Really. I'm not condoning what's happening now in many African countries, but the only way out of this is through a progressive registration and education and spreading this culture that my rights stop where yours begin, that I don't have to step on your toes to have my way.
Should the Continental Organization, the African Union, put a little bit more emphasis on some issues? For example, you in 1984-85, you were the deputy commissioner for the then Relief and Rehabilitation Commission. On your watch, close to 1 million people died. Although things have changed for the better these days, not only in Ethiopia but also in major other African countries, people cannot still feed themselves, and this could be a reason for conflict.
I would say 1 million people didn't die under my watch. Million more were saved when we had the Relief Commission operating properly, and when we had ears of the world. And you will be surprised that like every time when I'm given a job against my without me asking for it, I'm very reluctant to take. I had lots of misgivings about accepting the coordination of international aid. But I was totally overwhelmed and surprised by the response from the rest of the world. How was that possible? Because the government opened a little bit. It was a very dictatorial military junta that claimed to be Marxist-Leninist. At first, they were just as in the past, they were trying to hide the famine. When it got out of hand, they had to ask for help. They had to look for people who can speak the language of the West, and I happened to be one of them, and I was there to do that.
Although not on that scale, a number of African countries are facing the problems that I mentioned earlier on when I asked this question. Do you think the African Union is doing the right thing along that track?
I really am not very familiar now with that.
But I mean, I'm just trying
But generally,
to explore your perceptions about hunger in Africa, which is a factor that we need to deal with now.
Well, that's something that will be tackled when there is modernization in the agricultural sector. It depends on a lot of factors. It's not always the fault of this organization or this country or that country. I mean, famine had struck Europe, many parts of Europe. The Irish famine, you know very well. There was a time when even in Italy, most hard-working, productive people were on the verge of starvation. So it happens everywhere.
Yeah, what I'm saying is the organization's hands are tied. It always comes back to this issue, so much so that I think, and the critics say, that the organization has failed to address some critical issues that the continent faces today. I mean, is that, do you think, a fair thing, or is it overstretched, do you think? Or
I'm not going to be the devil's advocate. I mean, it's the organization has failed in certain ways, and in other ways it has very much succeeded. It has really accelerated the process of decolonization in Africa. It has faced head-on the apartheid regime in South Africa and the recalcitrant regimes in Portugal that wouldn't let go of their colonies. I mean, but it united Africa, and because of the moral strength, it united the rest of the world also behind the plight of these people who were suffering. It had done wonders in those areas. When you come to the economic and social development, all it can do is lay down the grounds for integration. Efforts have been made to have regional integration, to have West African, East African, and so on and so forth. That's not gone very well. Some signs of progress here and there, but generally that is not. Again, organizations are as good as their members want them to be. They can't solve the problem. If AU was not there, AU will be needed. If the United Nations is not there, the United Nations will be needed. They are not doing miracles, but without them, the world will be a lot worse off than with them.
You've seen the organization evolving, particularly in the last 10 years, when it became, well, in 2001, the African Union. You think it is on a solid ground?
Well, there are lots of things that I would like to see change in the AU. The bureaucracy has to be looked into very well. I don't know if the current setup really gives people the kind of authority they need to do what is to be done. Because there's always politics coming into it, no matter how strong and visionary the leader.
We had this nasty scenario incident last year when the union was trying to figure out who should be the next chairperson.
Yeah.
I mean, when there were a lot more issues that needed some kind of resolution in order to this person.
Yeah, it was nasty, but wasn't the presidential election in the United States nasty? It was very nasty too. That's politics. I mean, unfortunately, I'm not trying to push aside all these difficulties that nations and organizations are facing, but you have to look at the end result. She's doing a good job. There is support behind her from almost all the members, and hopefully she will have the kind of support that will allow her to do what has to be done.
And Ethiopia continues to be the seat of the AU?
Yes, Ethiopia continues to be the seat of the AU, and I think that issue is behind us, you know. There is no country that has done for the OAU as much, for the AU as much as this country. Now, when the liberation war was raging, in spite of the fact that Ethiopia and the emperor had all these former great powers breathing down their neck. They help out of their meager coffers the liberation movement, near and far, everywhere in Africa. And I am an eyewitness when they were not able to write a check because they didn't want to be detected by the British and the French. And the minister of Ethiopia carried a suitcase full of US dollars, handing them over to liberation movement. When things were a little, could be done a little opener, in an open way, because of the AU and so on, they trained, Ethiopia trained, even during Mengistu's time, and armed the liberation movements in southern Africa. And recently, tell me which country has given almost 200,000 square meters of city land to an organization free of charge and named every street after an African country that joined it. I mean, this, if you quantify this into dollar terms, it will come into billions of dollars, I tell you. Because, so this country has done a lot for the AU.
There have also been, you know, the war in Congo where we sent the troops. And
yes,
then
paid in money and
in the last whatever decade or two, you have all these conflicts where Ethiopian soldiers, troops,
absolutely,
part of the African peacekeeping missions and so on.
Definitely.
Is that the weight of history that keeps Ethiopia do what it does in terms of?
Yes, it is. You see, isolation was a terrible thing. I started talking about it earlier. When the Italian fascists invaded Ethiopia, no voice was heard because almost all colored people were under colonial rule. There were some sentiments here and there, as far back from Caribbean countries. The only country that supported Ethiopia's plight was Mexico in the League of Nations. And then, to his credit, the chairman of the assembly was a Romanian. When the emperor was making his plea that fell on deaf ears in Europe, there was a fifth column of the fascists who were heckling him in the assembly room. This Romanian chairman supposed to have stopped these hecklers and says, "Order in the room," and spoke about the emperor's right to make his speech. This was the only two, really, people or countries that have gone out of there. In fact, I'm very sorry that, I'm happy that there is a Mexican square. I'm very sorry that the Romanian guy is not honored in any way in Ethiopia. It's a very...
Well, you were the mayor of Addis Ababa. I should have known that a few years back.
I was a crisis manager at that time, more than being a mayor. But this is something, still a street named after him or some monument put up. And I've seen monuments around Addis Ababa for less deserving people than this guy, who had the courage of his conviction to shut the fascist fifth column in Geneva, to leave the room. On the other hand, the hue and cry by other people, including black Americans. I know that when my uncle was an ambassador right after the war, years after the war, he also went as an envoy, and he was recruiting some qualified people to come and help Ethiopia. Dr. Talbot came at that time, who was the editor of the Ethiopian Herald, and in fact he almost ran the Ministry of Information single-handedly at one time. And there were a lot of pilots came, black Americans, yes, from the Caribbean. The world was the helpless world, I mean, of colored people behind Ethiopia's plight, but they could not do anything. So when the opportunity arose to have a concrete support for Ethiopia, the emperor and his senior ministers jumped on it. I remember the jubilation in my own family. My grandfather was a deputy prime minister at that time. He's an old man who is not very internationally aware, but he knew that this was the end of Ethiopia's isolation. That Ethiopia was going to have brothers around that would cry for it and fight for it and so on and so forth.
Well, Dr. BerhaneDeressa, thank you for your time. Thank you for your reflections and thoughts on the Organization of African Unity and also, of course, on the African Union. Thank you for your time indeed. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure.